with Dark Phoenix doing the comic books justice, and as the mutants go intergalactic,
We're doing space missions now. Cool.
Dark Phoenix and its killer last trailer may prove that after 20 years of movies in the X-Men series. And sure, they've done some wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff to erase a few mistakes along the way, but if the franchise can weather a storm like this...
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else.
They can last stand through any apocalypse.
Go f yourself.
Anyway, writer-producer Simon Kinberg has been an influential creative X-Force for 8 of the films, and Dark Phoenix marks his directorial debut with Zach Penn, but the production and 2 groundbreaking comic book storylines were crammed into what became the lowest-rated film by IMDb fans.
Maybe it's time for us to move on.
Not everybody heals as fast as you, Logan.
And Kinberg has been waiting to take another crack at one of those comic books, the Dark Phoenix saga, since his Days of Future Past screenplay reset some important story elements, like making Jean Grey not dead anymore.
Whoa. Easy, pal.
Some things never change.
Marvel mastermind Kevin Feige has assured everyone that it'll be a very long time before the X-Men join the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Because you are afraid of our gifts. Because we are different.
Since Feige says the X-Men aren't in his 5-year plan, Kinberg has room to let his new Phoenix breathe. The original saga was told in 2 parts over 18 issues, so Sophie Turner could potentially return to the role or to outer space if the film takes flight.
Who are you? The better question is, who are you?
Now, Dark Phoenix isn't the only 2019 X-Men movie, as the New Mutants should finally be unleashed in August. The movie shot from July to September 2017, trailer in October 2017, but it got pushed over a year for scarier reshoots.
You've been through a lot. Get some rest.
While the franchise's future may seem uncertain after those 2 titles, the final Dark Phoenix trailer bodes well for fans of the comic books. Kinberg did have to stray from the original in one respect, since First Class already used the Hellfire Club and their infamous White Queen.
You're never going to get anything from me while I'm like this.
While Jessica Chastain's mysterious supervillain may include a few Emma Frosty elements, she's more of a gender-flipped mastermind, aka Jason Wingard, a powerful mutant who can alter or erase memories, corrupting Jean Grey and turning her evil.
When I lose control, bad things happen. But it feels good.
Deadpool finding his footing with 2 smash hits that'll definitely spawn a threequel, or that long-promised X-Force team-up. We have faith that these mutants won't take another last...
Are you threatening me?
That's right.
That would be a bad idea.
For more
There are movies that come and go, and then there are movies that feel like they are yelling at you, laughing with you, breaking the rules in front of you, and still somehow making you care. Deadpool 2 is exactly that kind of chaotic experience. It is loud, emotional in a weird way, full of jokes that sometimes cross the line and sometimes punch you in the heart when you least expect it. It is not just a superhero movie, it is a messy roller coaster about pain, humor, friendship, and finding meaning when everything feels broken. Now let's go deep into this world in parts, in simple words like a long conversation about a film that refuses to behave. Part 1: when Deadpool 2 was first announced, the idea sounded risky again, just like the first film. Hollywood usually plays safe with superheroes, but Deadpool is not safe at all. The character himself is built to destroy safety. He talks to the audience, makes fun of the studio, and even jokes about the budget of the movie while the movie is still running. That is already strange, but what makes Deadpool 2 even more interesting is that it tries to go bigger, funnier, and also more emotional than the first one. The development of the film started after the huge success of the first Deadpool. The studio realized that this character was not just a one time experiment. People actually wanted more of this madness. Ryan Reynolds, who plays Deadpool, became the center of everything. He was not just acting, he was deeply involved in shaping the tone, jokes, and even the direction of the character. It is rare in big superhero films for an actor to feel like they are literally building the personality of the movie, but here it really feels like that the writers also had a big challenge. How do you follow a film that already broke so many rules? How do you make a sequel that feels fresh but still keeps the same soul? The answer they found was to go bigger emotionally. The first movie was mostly about Wade Wilson's love story and revenge. The second one is about family, loss, and trying to become something better even when life keeps breaking you down. At the same time, they did not reduce the humor. In fact, they increased it. Deadpool 2 is full of jokes that come fast, sometimes too fast to even process. Some jokes land perfectly, some are messy, and some are intentionally awkward. But that is the point. The film does not want to be polished like a normal superhero movie. It wants to feel alive, unpredictable, and slightly dangerous. Casting also played a huge role in shaping the movie. Ryan Reynolds returns as Wade Wilson Deadpool, and his performance is still the backbone of everything. Without him, the film would not work at all. He brings sarcasm, emotional confusion, and a strange kind of charm that makes even his worst jokes feel entertaining. Josh Brolin joins as Cable, and this is a very important addition. Cable is the opposite of Deadpool in many ways. He is serious, calm, and driven by pain and revenge. This contrast between Deadpool's chaos and Cable's seriousness becomes one of the strongest parts of the movie. Every time they share the screen, it feels like two different worlds colliding. Zazie Beetz plays Domino, a character who brings something new to the superhero team dynamic. Her power is luck, which sounds simple but becomes very visually creative in the film. Instead of flashy explosions or laser beams, her scenes often show small moments where everything just happens to go perfectly in her favor. It makes her stand out in a film already full of unique characters. Then there is Julian Dennison as Russell, a young mutant whose story becomes emotionally important. He is not just a side character, he is central to the emotional conflict of the film. His relationship with Deadpool is complicated, sometimes funny, sometimes dark, and sometimes genuinely sad. The casting choices show that the film is not just about jokes or action. It is also about creating a strange family of broken characters who all deal with pain in different ways. Behind the camera, the production also had its own challenges. The success of the first film gave the creators more budget but also more expectations. Fans wanted more action, more jokes, more cameos, and more creativity. Balancing all of that is not easy. If you add too much, it becomes messy. If you add too little, it disappoints fans. Deadpool 2 tries to stay on the edge of chaos without falling apart completely. The tone of the film was one of the hardest things to maintain. It shifts between comedy and emotion very quickly. One moment you are laughing at a ridiculous joke, and the next moment you are watching a character deal with trauma or loss. This sudden shift is intentional. Life itself is not balanced, and this film tries to reflect that in its own exaggerated way. Even the production design and costumes stay simple but effective. Deadpool's suit remains iconic. It is red, black, and expressive in a way that matches his personality. Cable's design, on the other hand, is heavy, mechanical, and visually serious. This contrast helps visually tell the story even before characters speak. Music also plays an interesting role. The soundtrack mixes emotional background scores with completely unexpected pop songs. The film often uses music ironically, meaning a serious or violent scene might be paired with a cheerful or nostalgic song. This creates a strange feeling in the viewer's mind where humor and intensity mix together. One of the most famous aspects of Deadpool 2 is how self aware it is. The movie constantly reminds you that it is a movie. It jokes about sequels, about superhero cliches, about Fox Studios, and even about itself trying too hard. This kind of humor can easily fail if not done properly, but here it mostly works because it fits Deadpool's personality. He is a character who does not take anything seriously, including his own existence. At its core, though, the film is also about identity. Wade Wilson is still struggling with who he is. He hides his pain behind jokes, but the pain is still there. The movie slowly builds the idea that being a hero is not about having powers or costumes, but about choosing to protect something bigger than yourself, even when you feel broken inside. This emotional layer is what separates Deadpool 2 from just being a comedy action film. Under all the chaos, there is a story about loss, guilt, redemption, and finding meaning in strange places. The filming of Deadpool 2 was not a simple process where everything went smoothly from start to finish. Like the first movie, it carried a sense of controlled chaos, where creativity often clashed with pressure, deadlines, and the expectations of fans who were already obsessed with the character. The production team had to constantly balance two things: keeping the raw, unpredictable energy of Deadpool alive while also making sure the film still worked as a big studio blockbuster. Most of the filming took place in Vancouver, which once again doubled for various locations in the story. The city became a playground for action scenes, explosions, and stunts. What makes Deadpool 2 different from many superhero films is that it does not always rely heavily on glossy CGI environments. Instead, it often mixes real stunt work with visual effects, giving the action a slightly grounded feel even when things become completely insane. The director David Leitch, who came from a strong background in stunt coordination and action heavy films, brought a different energy to this sequel. His experience helped shape the action scenes into something more physical and rough around the edges. You can feel that many fight sequences are designed not just to look cool but to feel impactful. Characters get thrown into walls, cars explode in the background, and everything feels like it has weight even when the tone is comedic. One of the biggest improvements in the sequel is the scale of action. Compared to the first film, Deadpool 2 expands its world significantly. There are larger set pieces, more characters involved in battles, and more complex choreography. But the film never loses its sense of humor during these sequences. Deadpool himself often comments on the action as it is happening, almost like he is aware that he is part of a choreographed movie scene. This creates a strange but entertaining dual experience where you are watching both the action and a commentary on the action at the same time. Ryan Reynolds once again becomes the center of this chaos. His physical performance is just as important as his comedic timing. Even when he is wearing a mask most of the time, his body language carries the character. The way he moves during fights, the way he reacts to pain, and the way he suddenly shifts from seriousness to jokes all help maintain Deadpool's identity. Josh Brolin's Cable also required heavy physical preparation and visual effects enhancement. Cable is not just a normal fighter. He is a cybernetically enhanced soldier from the future. This meant his design had to be both practical and heavily augmented in post production. The glowing mechanical arm, the damaged eye, and his bulky presence all contribute to making him feel like a man who has lived through extreme war and suffering. Brolin plays him with restraint, never overacting, which actually makes his seriousness even more effective in contrast to Deadpool. Zazie Beetz' Domino is another highlight in terms of filming style. Her scenes are shot in a way that visually represents luck. Instead of showing traditional superpowers like energy blasts or telekinesis, the camera often follows small coincidences that lead to her success. A bullet missing her by inches, a falling object hitting the right target, or an enemy slipping at the perfect moment. These moments are filmed with precision and they create a unique rhythm that stands out from the rest of the movie. Julian Dennison's character Russell brings a different emotional tone to the filming process. Many of his scenes are more grounded and emotional compared to the chaotic energy surrounding Deadpool. This contrast required careful direction so that the film did not feel tonally broken. The filmmakers had to ensure that emotional scenes still felt connected to the overall world of absurd humor and violence. One of the most famous sequences in the film is the prison convoy scene where Deadpool and his team attempt a rescue operation. This scene is a perfect example of how the film blends action and comedy. It starts like a serious mission, builds tension, and then quickly spirals into chaos. Every character gets a moment to shine, and the action becomes almost rhythmic, like a carefully controlled explosion of violence and jokes. Another important aspect of production was the constant improvisation. Ryan Reynolds is known for adding jokes during filming, and many of Deadpool's funniest lines were not originally in the script. This improvisational style helped the film feel more natural and unpredictable. However, it also meant that editing became a huge challenge. The editors had to carefully balance scripted scenes with improvised moments without losing narrative structure. The visual effects team also had a huge workload. Deadpool 2 contains a large number of CGI enhancements, from explosions and superpowers to full character creations. One of the most complex digital characters is Juggernaut, who appears later in the film as a massive destructive force. Bringing him to life required combining motion capture with detailed animation to make him feel physically present in the world. Costume design remained relatively simple but effective. Deadpool's suit was slightly refined for better movement and durability during stunts. Cable's costume was built to look practical and worn, reflecting his time traveling, war heavy background. Domino's design was intentionally minimalist, with her signature look being her skin mark and simple tactical outfit, which helps keep attention on her expressions and movement rather than heavy costume detail. The tone during filming was reportedly light and playful despite the seriousness of some scenes. This is important because the film itself never feels overly dark, even when it deals with trauma or loss. The set environment helped maintain that balance. Crew members often had to switch between serious stunt coordination and comedic timing within minutes. Music composition also started taking shape during post production. The score by Tyler Bates blends orchestral tension with emotional depth and occasional humor. Instead of treating the film like a traditional superhero epic, the music adapts to Deadpool's personality. It shifts quickly, sometimes intense, sometimes playful, and sometimes surprisingly emotional. One of the unique challenges in filming Deadpool 2 was maintaining consistency in tone while switching between different emotional layers. A single scene might contain comedy, violence, emotional dialogue, and meta commentary all at once. This is extremely difficult to balance because too much comedy can reduce emotional impact and too much seriousness can break the character's identity. The filmmakers solve this by trusting Deadpool himself as the anchor. Since the character is aware of everything happening, his presence allows the film to jump between tones without feeling completely disconnected. Even when something serious happens, Deadpool often comments on it in a way that reminds the audience not to take everything too seriously. When Deadpool 2 moved into its final stages of production, one of the most important layers that shaped its identity was the music. The soundtrack and score were not just background elements. They actively influenced how scenes felt, often changing the meaning of what was happening on screen. The score was composed by Tyler Bates, who had already worked on the first film. His approach in Deadpool 2 was not to create a traditional superhero sound. Instead, he built something more flexible, something that could jump between emotion, comedy, and action without feeling out of place. The music often swells during emotional moments, then suddenly drops or shifts when Deadpool interrupts with a joke. This constant back and forth mirrors the personality of the main character himself alongside the score. The film's licensed soundtrack plays a huge role in shaping its tone. One of the most iconic choices is how the movie uses emotional or nostalgic songs in completely violent or absurd scenes. This contrast is intentional. It creates a strange emotional confusion in the viewer where you are not sure whether to laugh, feel tension, or just enjoy the chaos. This technique became one of the signature styles of the Deadpool films. The music writing process also had to account for timing issues. Because many scenes included improvisation from Ryan Reynolds and last minute joke changes, the music team had to constantly adjust cues. A scene that was originally planned as serious might suddenly become comedic in editing, which meant the score had to adapt quickly. When it came to release, the marketing campaign for Deadpool 2 was almost as famous as the movie itself. Instead of traditional promotional material, the marketing team leaned heavily into Deadpool's personality. Trailers often broke the fourth wall, teased fake films, or included humorous edits that made fun of superhero cliches. This marketing style helped build massive hype, especially online. The film was released in 2018 across global markets, and the anticipation was extremely high. The first Deadpool had already proven that an R rated superhero movie could succeed massively, so expectations for the sequel were even bigger. Fans were not just waiting for action, they were waiting for jokes, emotional depth, and surprises. When the movie finally released, audience reactions were immediately strong. Many viewers appreciated how the film expanded its emotional core while keeping the humor intact. Others were drawn to its unpredictability. Unlike many superhero sequels that follow a strict formula, Deadpool 2 often feels like it is actively breaking its own structure while still telling a coherent story. Critics had mixed but generally positive responses. Some praised its bold humor, emotional moments, and character chemistry. Others felt that the constant joke density sometimes overwhelmed the story. However, even critics who were unsure about the tone often acknowledged that the film was ambitious and unique compared to standard superhero releases. One of the strongest aspects of reception was the performance of Ryan Reynolds. His portrayal of Deadpool was widely seen as perfect casting. The way he balances sarcasm with vulnerability gives the character depth beyond the jokes. Even when the film is chaotic, his emotional moments often land unexpectedly well. Josh Brolin's performance as Cable was also widely praised. His serious tone provided a necessary anchor for the film's chaos. Without Cable's grounded personality, the movie could have easily become too unstructured. Instead, his presence helps balance the emotional and comedic extremes. Zazie Beetz as Domino also received positive attention, especially for how her character stands out visually and conceptually. Her luck ability was seen as one of the most creative superhero powers in recent memory, mainly because it is shown in subtle and clever ways rather than flashy effects. From a box office perspective, the film was a major success. It earned a strong global total, proving again that R rated superhero films could perform at the highest commercial level. The audience was not limited to comic book fans, it included casual viewers who were attracted by humor, action, and word of mouth popularity. International markets also responded well, although some humor was considered very Western specific and did not translate equally everywhere. Still, the action and character dynamics were strong enough to maintain global appeal. Beyond money and reviews, one of the most interesting impacts of Deadpool 2 is its meme culture. The film is filled with moments designed for internet sharing. Whether it is Deadpool making fun of himself, unexpected cameo scenes, or exaggerated emotional jokes, many parts of the film quickly became viral online. The X Force sequence, for example, became one of the most talked about moments. The way the team is introduced as a serious new superhero group only for things to go wrong almost immediately is a perfect example of the film's style. It builds expectations and then destroys them in a comedic way. The film also uses meta humor heavily, which became a major talking point in online discussions. Deadpool constantly refers to movie logic, studio decisions, and even audience expectations. This level of self awareness made the film feel like it was both inside and outside the superhero genre at the same time. Another important aspect of cultural impact is how the film handles emotional storytelling under a layer of comedy. Many viewers were surprised that a movie filled with jokes could still deliver moments of genuine sadness and reflection. The relationship between Deadpool and Russell, for example, adds emotional weight that stays with the story even after the jokes fade. Over time, Deadpool 2 became more than just a sequel. It became a reference point for how far superhero films could push humor and structure while still maintaining emotional grounding. It showed that audiences were open to experiments even in large franchise films. As discussions continued after release, many fans began comparing it with other superhero sequels, often highlighting its willingness to take risks. While not every risk works perfectly, the film's boldness is what makes it memorable. When looking deeper into Deadpool 2, it becomes clear that the film is not only built on jokes and action, but also on a strange emotional structure that hides itself under comedy. On the surface, it looks like chaos, but underneath, there is a consistent theme about broken people trying to find a reason to keep going. The main character, Wade Wilson, is not a traditional hero. He does not start as someone noble or clean. He is damaged physically and emotionally, and he uses humor as a shield. This is one of the most important ideas in the film. Almost every joke he makes is not just for comedy but also a way to avoid dealing with pain. The movie slowly reveals that behind the mask and sarcasm, there is someone who is still trying to understand love, loss, and responsibility. One of the strongest emotional threads in the film is his connection with Russell. At first, it seems like just a rescue mission, but as the story develops, it becomes something closer to a broken family dynamic. Wade sees himself in Russell, someone who is angry, misunderstood, and capable of destruction if pushed too far. This reflection is what drives much of the emotional conflict in the story. Cable, on the other hand, represents the opposite side of the emotional spectrum. He is driven by grief, but he expresses it through control, discipline, and violence. Where Wade jokes, Cable stays silent. Where Wade avoids pain, Cable confronts it directly. This contrast creates a deeper message. People deal with trauma in completely different ways, and neither approach is fully right or wrong. Domino adds another layer to this theme, but in a lighter way. Her luck power can be seen as a metaphor for trust in life. She does not try to control everything. Instead, she moves forward and things simply work in her favor. In a film full of chaos and control issues, she represents flow and acceptance. This makes her one of the most interesting symbolic characters in the story. The film also continues Deadpool's relationship with the audience. He is constantly aware that he is in a movie. He breaks the fourth wall not just for jokes, but sometimes to comment on emotional beats or predict audience reactions. This creates a strange experience where the viewer is both inside and outside the story at the same time. It challenges the traditional way movies are supposed to be watched. Another major theme is redemption. Wade spends much of the film trying to become something better, even if he does not fully understand what better means. His idea of heroism is messy. He fails, he overreacts, he makes selfish decisions, but he still tries. The film suggests that being a hero is not about perfection, but about willingness to change. Visually, the movie reinforces these themes through contrast. Bright colors are often used during violent scenes, making destruction feel almost cartoonish. Slow motion shots are used not just for style but to emphasize emotional moments or absurdity. Even death scenes are sometimes treated with humor, which creates discomfort but also reflection. The humor itself has layers. On one level, it is simple jokes, pop culture references, and physical comedy. On another level, it is satire of superhero culture. The film mocks sequel formulas, team building tropes, and even tragic backstories that are common in comic book films. But at the deepest level, the humor is also a coping mechanism both for the character and the film itself. One of the most interesting ideas in Deadpool 2 is how it treats failure. Many superhero stories focus on victory and success, but this film allows failure to exist in a more visible way. Characters make mistakes that actually matter. Plans go wrong, teams fall apart. Even Deadpool, who often acts invincible in tone, suffers consequences that shape the story. The emotional core of the film becomes even clearer in its ending, where sacrifice and responsibility are finally taken seriously. Without removing the humor, the film still manages to show that actions have weight. This balance is difficult to achieve, and it is one of the reasons the movie stands out in the superhero genre. Over time, the legacy of Deadpool 2 has become more significant than its initial release moment. It helped prove that audiences could accept tonal experiments inside blockbuster films. It also showed that emotional storytelling does not need to be separated from comedy. Both can exist together if handled carefully. In the larger evolution of superhero cinema, the film sits in an interesting position. It is not as traditionally structured as many Marvel or DC films, but it still belongs to that universe of comic book storytelling. It acts almost like a commentary on the genre while still participating in it fully. That dual identity is rare and difficult to maintain. Fans continue to revisit the film not just for action or jokes, but for specific moments that combine humor and emotion in unexpected ways. Some scenes become funnier on rewatch, while others become more emotional once the story is fully understood. This layered experience is part of what keeps the film alive in online discussions. Memes and internet culture have also helped extend its lifespan. Deadpool's personality fits perfectly into internet humor, self aware, sarcastic, and constantly reacting to itself. Because of this, the film did not fade after release. Instead, it continued circulating through clips, quotes, and references. Even years later, discussions about the film often return to the same question: is it just a comedy or something more? The answer is that it is both. It is intentionally silly but also carefully built around emotional truths about loss, identity, and growth. In the end, Deadpool 2 works because it refuses to choose a single identity. It is a superhero film, a comedy, a satire, and a personal story all at once. That combination is messy, but it is also what makes it memorable. The long term impact of Deadpool 2 becomes clearer when you look at how it influenced audience expectations for superhero storytelling. Before this film, most big comic book movies were leaning heavily into either serious tones or carefully balanced humor that never fully broke structure. Deadpool 2 pushed in the opposite direction by refusing to behave like a proper sequel at all, even while still following a recognizable superhero plot. One of the biggest shifts it encouraged was the acceptance of tonal instability as a feature instead of a flaw. In earlier cinema logic, switching from comedy to tragedy too quickly was considered a mistake. But this film makes that switch constantly, and instead of breaking the experience, it creates its identity. This taught both audiences and creators that emotional whiplash can actually feel intentional if the character justifies it. Another important legacy is how the film redefined what a superhero team introduction could look like. The formation of groups like X Force is presented in a way that initially feels like a traditional build up, but then it immediately dismantles expectations. This approach became a reference point in later films and shows where audiences began expecting subversion rather than straight payoff. Ryan Reynolds' portrayal of Wade Wilson also became a cultural blueprint for meta characters. While breaking the fourth wall existed long before Deadpool, this film normalized it at blockbuster scale. The character doesn't just talk to the audience occasionally, he actively comments on structure, casting, budget logic, and even sequel fatigue. This level of self awareness influenced how later comedic or experimental superhero characters were written. From a storytelling perspective, the film also contributed to the idea that immature humor and emotional depth are not mutually exclusive. At first glance, many jokes seem intentionally childish or absurd, but the film repeatedly uses them as a gateway into vulnerability. Wade's humor is not separate from his trauma, it is a direct result of it. This connection between comedy and emotional defense mechanisms became a widely discussed aspect of the character's writing. Even supporting characters contribute to the film's thematic structure in ways that are easy to miss on a casual watch. Cable's rigid seriousness is not just a contrast for humor, it represents grief that has become frozen in time. Domino's effortless survival luck is not just a gimmick, it reflects a worldview where trust replaces control. Russell's anger is not just a plot device, it represents how pain can either destroy or reshape identity depending on guidance. When all of these elements are combined, the film starts to feel less like a standard superhero sequel and more like a conversation about emotional survival disguised as entertainment. It uses genre structure as a mask, the same way Wade uses humor as a mask. The visual storytelling also supports this idea. The film often uses contrast between destruction and color or violence and music to blur emotional interpretation. A scene may feel funny in one moment and unsettling in the next, forcing the viewer to constantly reevaluate their reaction. This is not accidental, it is part of how the film keeps its audience mentally engaged rather than passively consuming action. In terms of pacing, Deadpool 2 deliberately avoids traditional rhythm. Most films build tension in a steady curve, but here the pacing feels more like spikes. Moments of calm are quickly interrupted by jokes, action, or narrative twists. This unpredictability mirrors Wade's unstable mindset and keeps the audience in a similar emotional state. Another long term effect of the film is how it influenced marketing strategies. Its promotional campaigns blurred the line between advertisement and entertainment. Instead of simply promoting the film, the marketing became part of the Deadpool personality itself. This approach later inspired other films to adopt more character driven promotional content, especially for comedic or self aware projects. On a deeper cultural level, the film helped normalize the idea that superhero fatigue could be addressed not by avoiding the genre, but by mocking and reinventing it from within. Rather than stepping away from superhero conventions, it leans into them and exaggerates them until they become satire. This method gave audiences a fresh way to engage with familiar material. The emotional ending of the film also deserves long term reflection. While the story is filled with jokes and chaos, its conclusion reinforces the idea that change is possible, even for someone who constantly resists it. Wade's growth is not dramatic or clean, it is small, inconsistent, and imperfect. But that is what makes it feel believable within the film's own chaotic logic. As time passes, the film's reputation has become more stable and appreciated. What may have initially felt like pure comedic overload is now often seen as carefully structured chaos. Viewers begin to notice how tightly controlled the randomness actually is. Even the most absurd jokes usually serve a thematic or emotional purpose. In the wider evolution of comic book cinema, Deadpool 2 stands as a reminder that experimentation is not just possible in big budget films, but sometimes necessary for the genre to stay alive. It proves that audiences are willing to follow a story that constantly changes tone, breaks rules, and refuses to behave predictably as long as the emotional core remains strong, and that emotional core is ultimately what holds everything together. Beneath the jokes, references, and chaos, the film is still about people who are trying imperfectly to deal with pain, loss, and the hope of becoming something better than what they started as. Even after everything already said about Deadpool 2, there is still a quieter layer that often gets ignored: the film's relationship with risk. Most big superhero films are built to avoid risk as much as possible. They follow patterns that have already proven successful. But Deadpool 2 constantly chooses to step outside that comfort zone, sometimes in ways that feel almost careless but are actually carefully designed. One of the biggest risks is emotional honesty inside a comedy heavy structure. It would have been easy for the film to stay fully comedic and never slow down long enough to explore grief or responsibility. Instead, it repeatedly interrupts its own humor to deal with emotional consequences. This makes the film less predictable but also more human in a strange way. It suggests that even in a world full of jokes, pain does not disappear. It just gets layered underneath. Another risk is how the film treats its own supporting cast. Many superhero sequels introduce large teams and then treat them as permanent additions. Deadpool 2 does the opposite in a very bold way, especially with the X Force concept. It builds expectation, introduces characters with style, and then dismantles the entire idea in a way that shocks both the audience and the narrative itself. This decision is not just a joke, it is a commentary on how quickly audiences consume and forget team building hype in modern franchises. The film also takes a risk in how it refuses to respect traditional villain structure. Instead of presenting a clear classic antagonist, it builds conflict through emotional misunderstanding and personal trauma. Even characters who act like enemies are not purely evil, they are shaped by loss, anger, or survival instincts. This makes the story more complex but also less predictable because there is no simple moral line separating good and bad. A subtle but important part of the film's identity is how it treats time and consequence. With Cable's presence as a time traveling soldier, the movie introduces the idea that future outcomes can be changed. But instead of fully exploring complex time travel logic, the film uses it as an emotional tool. It asks a simple question: if you could change the future, would you fix everything or would you learn to live with pain instead? This question quietly sits underneath the action. The humor itself also becomes more layered the more you think about it. At first, it feels like fast jokes, references, and absurd interruptions. But many of these jokes are actually reflections of insecurity. Wade constantly mocks seriousness, but the film occasionally shows that he is afraid of it. Seriousness means facing reality, and reality is something he avoids until he has no choice. This is why the relationship between comedy and tragedy in the film feels so tightly connected. It is not random contrast, it is emotional balance. The louder the jokes get, the more you can sense that something underneath is being avoided. When the film finally slows down, those avoided emotions rise to the surface. Another interesting aspect is how the film subtly comments on hero identity. Traditional superhero stories often define heroes by destiny or clear moral alignment. Deadpool 2 rejects that idea. Its main character is not chosen, not noble, and not consistent. He becomes heroic only through repeated failure and correction. This creates a more realistic idea of growth, one that is messy and unstructured. Even Cable's arc reinforces this idea. He begins as someone who believes in fixed outcomes and rigid purpose, but by the end, his decisions suggest that change is possible, even for someone who has spent his life locked into grief driven motivation. The film does not fully resolve his pain, but it softens it, showing that emotional evolution is gradual rather than instant. Damino's role continues to stand out in this deeper analysis. Her presence challenges the idea that struggle is always necessary for success. In a world where every other character is fighting, forcing, or resisting, she simply moves forward and lets outcomes align in her favor. This can be interpreted as a philosophical contrast. Sometimes control is not about force but about acceptance. The film structure itself mirrors its themes. It constantly breaks itself, jokes about itself, then rebuilds its narrative again. This unstable structure reflects Wade's internal state. Instead of a smooth emotional arc, the story feels like fragments slowly coming together. This makes the viewing experience more active than passive. You are constantly adjusting your understanding. Another layer worth noticing is how the film handles violence. While it is exaggerated and often comedic, it is also frequent and sometimes sudden. This creates a strange dual feeling where violence is both entertainment and discomfort. The film never fully lets the viewer settle into one emotional response. It keeps shifting between amusement and awareness. Over time, this approach has made the film more rewatchable. On first viewing, the chaos is overwhelming. On later viewings, patterns become clearer. You start noticing how certain jokes connect to emotional beats or how certain action scenes mirror character development. What initially looks random reveals itself as structured unpredictability. Culturally, the film also contributed to a broader shift in how audiences discuss superhero movies. Instead of only focusing on power levels, villains, or universe connections, viewers began talking more about tone, identity, and emotional writing. Deadpool 2 helped expand the conversation beyond traditional genre limits. Its influence can also be seen in how later films became more comfortable with breaking tone rules or inserting self aware humor without fully collapsing into parody. However, few have matched its level of controlled chaos because it requires a very specific balance between writing, performance, and direction. In the end, what keeps Deadpool 2 interesting is not just its jokes or action, but its refusal to stay in one category. It is not fully satire, not fully parody, not fully drama, and not fully traditional superhero film. It exists in the space between all of them. That in between space is exactly where its identity lives. And that is why, even after all analysis, explanations, and breakdowns, the film still feels slightly unpredictable. It does not settle into a single meaning, it keeps shifting, just like its main character. By the time we reach the final layer of understanding Deadpool 2, it becomes clear that the film is less about telling a straight story and more about creating an experience that keeps shifting its own meaning while it plays. It is built like a conversation that interrupts itself, laughs at itself, and still somehow arrives at a conclusion that feels emotionally complete. One of the deeper ideas running through the film is the concept of chosen identity. Wade Wilson is not someone who naturally fits into the idea of a hero. He resists structure, avoids responsibility, and constantly hides behind humor. Yet the story keeps forcing him into situations where he must act with responsibility whether he wants to or not. This tension between resistance and obligation is what drives his growth. What makes this interesting is that the film never fully transforms him into a traditional hero. Instead, it slightly adjusts him. He remains chaotic, unpredictable, and flawed. But within that chaos, he begins to make choices that are less selfish than before. The film suggests that growth does not erase personality, it just redirects it. This idea also applies to the supporting characters. Cable does not become more humorous or relaxed by the end. He remains serious, but his seriousness becomes less destructive and more reflective. Domino does not change her personality at all, yet her presence influences the emotional balance of the group. Russell does not instantly become healed or stable, but he is redirected away from a darker path. In each case, change is subtle rather than dramatic. Another important layer is how the film treats consequence in a genre that often avoids it. Many superhero films reset emotional damage quickly or ignore long term effects for the sake of future sequels. Deadpool 2, however, allows certain consequences to remain visible. Loss is not erased. Choices matter even when the tone is comedic. This gives weight to moments that might otherwise feel temporary. Even Deadpool's humor, which often disrupts seriousness, eventually becomes part of the consequence system. His jokes are not just entertainment, they are avoidance mechanisms. And when those mechanisms fail, emotional reality becomes unavoidable. This is why some of the quieter moments in the film feel unexpectedly strong. They arrive after long stretches of noise, making them more noticeable. A key aspect of the film's design is its relationship with audience awareness. Deadpool is not just aware that he is in a movie, he is aware of how audiences respond to movies. He predicts reactions, comments on expectations, and even mocks predictable emotional beats before they happen. This creates a strange loop where the film is partially about itself and partially about the viewer watching it. This self awareness could easily become exhausting or empty, but the film avoids that by grounding it in emotional stakes. The fourth wall breaking is not just a gimmick, it is part of Wade's personality. It reflects his inability to fully commit to any single reality. He is always half inside the story and half outside it, which mirrors his emotional distance from his own pain. Another deeper interpretation of the film is that it is about control versus surrender. Cable represents control. He believes outcomes can be fixed through force, precision, and determination. Wade represents surrender, not in a peaceful sense but in a chaotic acceptance that life rarely follows plans. Domino represents a third option, trust in flow without resistance. The conflict between these perspectives is not fully resolved, but it is balanced by the end. The film's ending reinforces this balance rather than resolving it neatly. Instead of fully concluding every emotional thread, it leaves certain elements open, slightly imperfect, and ongoing. This matches its overall philosophy. Life does not close in clean chapters, it continues with unresolved edges. On a technical level, the editing style also contributes to this feeling. Scenes often transition abruptly, jokes interrupt emotional build up, and action sequences shift tone mid moment. This creates a rhythm that feels unstable but intentional. It forces the viewer to stay alert, never fully settling into comfort. Even the cinematography supports this idea. Shots often frame chaos within controlled compositions, suggesting that even disorder exists inside structure. This visual contradiction reinforces the film's core message. Order and chaos are not separate, they exist together constantly. As time passes, Deadpool 2 continues to stand out not because it is the most polished superhero film, but because it is one of the most self aware experiments within the genre. It does not try to compete with traditional superhero epics on their terms. Instead, it builds its own rules and follows them consistently, even when those rules appear inconsistent. Its legacy is not just about humor or action, but about permission. Permission for superhero films to be weird, emotionally unstable, structurally unpredictable, and still successful. It showed that audiences can follow complexity as long as there is an emotional anchor holding everything together. At its core, the film remains about broken people trying to function in a world that does not make sense. That is why, despite all the jokes, references, and chaos, the emotional memory of it lingers. It is not clean or perfect, but it is alive in a way that feels deliberate. At this point, Deadpool 2 starts to feel less like a sequel and more like a long experiment in how far a mainstream superhero movie can stretch itself before it breaks and then somehow still lands on its feet. What keeps it from collapsing under its own chaos is the fact that underneath everything, it always returns to character emotion, even if it arrives there through jokes, explosions, or complete narrative detours. One of the final deeper layers worth noticing is how the film plays with the idea of audience manipulation but in a self aware way. Most films try to guide the viewer's emotions without drawing attention to the process. Deadpool 2 does the opposite. It constantly shows you that it is manipulating you, then laughs about it, then still makes you feel something anyway. That contradiction is part of its design. This becomes especially clear in how the film handles surprise and expectation. It sets up patterns that feel familiar, team formation, redemption arc, villain confrontation, but then repeatedly interrupts or reshapes them. The audience begins to anticipate the twist on the twist, which creates a layered viewing experience. You are no longer just watching events, you are predicting how the film will break its own structure next. Another subtle idea is how the film treats memory and legacy within its own universe. Characters carry emotional baggage from events that are sometimes serious and sometimes absurd, but the film never fully separates the two. In Wade's world, even ridiculous experiences become emotionally significant if they affect him personally. This blends comedy and memory into a single emotional language. Cable's presence also continues to represent something more philosophical in this final layer of interpretation, the illusion of certainty. He believes he comes from a future that is fixed, where outcomes are known and tragedy is inevitable unless corrected. But the film slowly challenges this idea by showing that certainty does not actually remove pain, it only delays acceptance. His arc is less about saving the future and more about learning to live with uncertainty. Demino's role, meanwhile, becomes even more meaningful when viewed from this perspective. She is the only character who does not fight against uncertainty. She moves with it. Her luck is not just a power, it is a narrative counterpoint to every attempt at control in the film. Where others struggle to force outcomes, she flows through them. This contrast quietly reinforces one of the film's central philosophies. Control is not always the answer. Russell's storyline also leaves behind an important emotional echo. His anger is never fully erased, nor is it meant to be. Instead, it is redirected. The film avoids the overly clean resolution common in many superhero stories, where trauma is completely resolved by the end. Instead, it suggests that trauma can be guided, softened, or understood but rarely deleted. That realism, hidden under layers of humor, gives the story more emotional durability than it initially appears to have. Another overlooked aspect is how the film treats identity performance. Almost every character is performing in some way. Deadpool performs humor to hide vulnerability. Cable performs control to hide grief. Even villains perform authority or threat to maintain power. The film subtly suggests that identity itself is often a performance shaped by pain, expectation, and environment. This idea connects directly back to the film's constant breaking of the fourth wall. Wade is not just performing for other characters, he is performing for the audience and sometimes even acknowledging that performance mid performance. This creates a loop where identity, story, and awareness all blend together. From a broader cinematic perspective, Deadpool 2 also reflects a transitional moment in superhero filmmaking. It exists between two eras. One where franchises were becoming increasingly formulaic, and another where experimentation and genre blending became more accepted. It helped prove that audiences were not just tolerating risk, they were actively engaging with it. The film's endurance in pop culture also comes from its rewatch value. On first viewing, it feels fast, loud, and overwhelming. On repeat viewing, structure becomes more visible. Jokes reveal foreshadowing, emotional scenes gain weight, even background details start to feel intentional. This layered construction is one of the reasons it remains relevant years after release. At a cultural level, it also reinforced the idea that superhero films could openly acknowledge their own absurdity without losing audience investment. Instead of pretending the genre is always serious or always grounded, it embraces contradiction. It can be silly and emotional, violent and self aware, structured and chaotic all at once, and that brings everything back to its central identity. Deadpool 2 is not trying to resolve the tension between opposites. It is trying to live inside that tension. It accepts contradiction as its natural state rather than something to fix. That is why, even after extended analysis, it still feels slightly unclassifiable. It refuses to fully settle into any single definition. It exists as a shifting combination of satire, emotion, parody, and action. In the end, the film's real achievement is not just what happens in its story, but how it makes the viewer experience storytelling itself. It turns structure into something visible, emotion into something unexpected, and humor into something that occasionally carries weight. At this final stretch of reflection on Deadpool 2, what stands out most is how the film gradually turns itself into a mirror of contradiction, one that reflects both the chaos of modern blockbuster storytelling and the emotional confusion of its main character. It never tries to resolve these contradictions cleanly. Instead, it lets them coexist until the end, like unresolved thoughts that still feel complete in their own way. One of the most lasting impressions the film leaves is its relationship with imperfection. In most big budget superhero films, imperfection is something to be minimized. Scenes are polished, character arcs are smooth, and emotional beats are carefully controlled. Deadpool 2 does the opposite. It embraces imperfection as part of its identity. Jokes sometimes overstay their welcome, emotional shifts sometimes feel abrupt, action sometimes becomes overwhelming. But all of this contributes to its personality rather than weakening it. This connects directly to its central character philosophy. Wade Wilson is not a finished hero at any point in the story. He does not reach a final stable version of himself. Instead, he exists in a constant state of adjustment. Every event slightly reshapes him but never fully completes him. This idea that people are always in progress rather than finished products is quietly one of the film's strongest emotional messages. Another important layer is how the film treats failure as a narrative tool. Many superhero stories treat failure as a temporary setback before a final victory. In Deadpool 2, failure is more constant and more visible. Plans collapse, decisions backfire, emotional choices lead to unintended consequences. But instead of resetting the story, these failures accumulate and shape the direction of character relationships. This gives the film a more lived in feeling, even within its exaggerated tone. The film also plays with the idea of audience fatigue in a very direct way. It constantly jokes about sequels, formula repetition, and superhero cliches, but it never actually distances itself from them. Instead, it operates inside those cliches while commenting on them. This creates a dual experience. You are watching a genre film while also being reminded that it is a genre film. That awareness becomes part of the entertainment. In a broader sense, Deadpool 2 can also be seen as a commentary on attention itself. Its rapid pacing, constant joke delivery, and shifting tones reflect a modern viewing environment where attention is fragmented. The film does not resist this, it adapts to it. It assumes the viewer's mind is always partially elsewhere and builds itself to constantly pull attention back through surprise, humor, or emotional interruption. Cable's storyline, when viewed from this final analytical angle, also takes on a more symbolic meaning. He represents a mindset that believes everything meaningful is already determined, already written, already set in motion. Wade represents the opposite, a belief that even chaotic, broken moments can still be reshaped through action and connection. The film does not fully declare one philosophy correct over the other. Instead, it suggests that both coexist in tension and human behavior constantly shifts between them. Domino's presence continues to feel almost philosophical in contrast. She does not try to interpret life in terms of meaning or control, she simply moves through it. In many ways, she becomes the quiet counterweight to both Wade's chaos and Cable's control. Her role suggests that not everything needs to be fought or analyzed. Some things can simply be allowed to unfold. Even the film's humor, when examined in isolation from its immediate comedic effect, begins to reveal a structure of emotional deflection and release. Jokes arrive not just to entertain but to prevent emotional saturation. When scenes become too intense, humor intervenes. When emotions rise too high, absurdity cuts through them. This rhythm creates a push and pull that defines the entire viewing experience. What makes this approach interesting in the long term is how it repositions the audience's expectations. Instead of being passive receivers of emotional cues, viewers are constantly repositioned between laughter and reflection. The film does not allow long emotional immersion without interruption, which changes how emotional impact is processed. And yet, despite all this fragmentation, the film still manages to feel complete. That is perhaps its most unusual achievement. It does not achieve completeness through traditional narrative harmony but through thematic consistency. Everything, jokes, action, emotional beats, character arcs, keeps returning to the same core ideas: identity, loss, connection, control, and change. By the time the film ends, there is no attempt to present a perfectly closed story. Instead, it leaves behind a sense of continuation. The characters are not finished, their emotional states are not resolved into final answers. They are simply in a different place than they were before, still moving forward in an unpredictable direction. At this final point of reflection on Deadpool 2, there is not really a new story layer left to uncover in terms of plot or production. What remains is the after image of the film, how it sits in memory, how it reshapes expectations, and why it continues to feel oddly present even years later. One of the most interesting things about the film's afterlife is how it behaves differently depending on how you revisit it. On a first watch, it feels loud, fast, and almost overwhelming in its joke density. On later viewings, the structure becomes more visible and the chaos starts to feel less random. You begin to notice patterns, emotional setups, hidden inside jokes, callbacks disguised as throwaway lines, and character decisions that quietly build continuity beneath the surface noise. This is where the film reveals one of its quiet strengths. It is not only written for immediate impact but also for delayed understanding. Many of its emotional beats land more clearly after you already know where the story is going. That means the film effectively has two experiences. The first is reactive and the second is reflective. Another long term aspect is how the film changes the way audiences interpret humor in emotional storytelling. Before films like this, humor and emotion were often treated as separate lanes, but Deadpool 2 insists they are constantly overlapping. A joke does not cancel emotion, it often carries it. A serious moment does not remove humor, it sometimes emerges from it. This blending creates a more fluid emotional language that feels closer to real human coping mechanisms. Even the character of Wade Wilson becomes more interesting over time because he is not static. His humor, which initially feels like pure entertainment, gradually reads as emotional self defense. His fourth wall awareness, which seems like a gimmick at first, becomes a form of distance from pain. And his moments of sincerity, which are rare and brief, feel more meaningful because they are surrounded by so much noise. Cable's presence also lingers in a different way after the film ends. He is not just a contrasting personality within the story, he becomes a reminder of how grief can freeze a person's worldview. His belief in fixed outcomes is emotionally understandable, even if the film gently pushes against it. Over time, he feels less like a serious character in a comedy and more like a person trapped in a mindset the story is slowly trying to loosen. Domino, meanwhile, remains one of the most quietly memorable elements of the film precisely because she resists over explanation. Her ability is never turned into deep exposition heavy rules. Instead, it stays visually intuitive and narratively simple. That simplicity becomes symbolic in a film full of complexity. She works not because she is heavily explained, but because she is allowed to remain conceptually clean. Russell's arc, when remembered after the film ends, becomes less about the immediate conflict and more about emotional direction. The film does not attempt to fix him in a traditional sense. Instead, it redirects him away from destruction towards something less defined but more hopeful. That lack of perfect resolution makes his storyline feel more realistic than many polished superhero arcs. Another reason the film continues to resonate is its relationship with audience participation. Deadpool 2 does not just present jokes. It often depends on the audience recognizing patterns, expectations, and genre knowledge. It assumes viewers understand superhero cliches well enough to notice when they are being twisted. This creates a shared language between film and audience, almost like an ongoing inside joke that extends beyond the screen. Over time, this shared language is one of the reasons the film remains culturally active. It is frequently referenced not just for specific scenes but for its general attitude towards storytelling. It represents a kind of cinematic permission slip, permission to be chaotic, self aware, emotionally inconsistent, and still meaningful. Even its imperfections contribute to this identity. Some transitions are abrupt, some jokes land differently depending on viewer taste, and some tonal shifts feel intentionally uneven. But these elements reinforce its central idea rather than weakening it. The film is not trying to be seamless, it is trying to feel alive, and that is where its lasting impression ultimately comes from, not perfection but energy. A sense that the film is constantly aware of itself, constantly reacting and constantly moving between tones without fully settling. In the end, what remains after everything, the analysis, the humor, the action, the emotional layers, is not a single clear definition of what the film is. Instead, what remains is the feeling of it. Fast, unstable, self aware, strangely emotional, and always slightly out of control, yet still purposeful in its movement forward. And even when the story is over, that feeling does not fully stop. At this stage, Deadpool 2 stops feeling like something that simply ends us and starts feeling like something that leaves echoes behind. Not in the sense of a sequel hook or franchise setup, but in the way certain experiences keep replaying in fragments, jokes, emotional beats, visual moments, each one carrying a slightly different meaning depending on when you remember it. One of the most interesting after effects of the film is how it trains the viewer's attention. After watching it, you start noticing how other superhero films behave more predictably. Clean emotional arcs, structured humor, carefully timed seriousness, all of these start to feel more visible as construction rather than natural flow. Deadpool 2, by contrast, makes its construction obvious while still trying to feel spontaneous. That contrast stays in your mind long after the credits. It also changes how you interpret sincerity in a film filled with irony. Because so much of the dialogue is layered with jokes, sarcasm, or meta commentary, the rare moments of sincerity stand out even more. They are not presented as big emotional speeches, they are often short, almost hesitant interruptions in the chaos. This makes sincerity feel less like a performance and more like something that accidentally slips through the noise. Another subtle long term effect is how film reframes the idea of consistency in storytelling. Traditional storytelling values consistent tone, consistent character behavior, and consistent emotional pacing. Deadpool 2 disrupts all three at different points, yet still feels coherent. This suggests that coherence does not always come from uniformity. It can also come from repetition of underlying themes even when surface structure changes. That is why, even when scenes feel tonally different, they still belong to the same emotional ecosystem. Everything keeps circling back to identity, loss, responsibility, and the uncomfortable process of change. The film does not need strict consistency in tone because it has consistency in emotional direction. Cable's worldview, when reflected on further, becomes even more symbolic in hindsight. His belief in a fixed timeline represents a mindset that many people relate to on a metaphorical level. The idea that outcomes are already decided, that effort can only do so much, that loss is unavoidable. The film gently pushes against this, not by denying pain but by suggesting that meaning exists even within unpredictable outcomes. Domino's luck, when reconsidered in this context, almost becomes a philosophical counter-argument. Instead of fighting determinism, she exists alongside it in a way that feels effortless. Her success is not about control or destiny, it is about acceptance and movement. In a film filled with characters trying to force outcome, she is the only one who does not appear to struggle against reality itself. Russell's emotional trajectory also gains weight when viewed from a distance. His anger is not treated as a problem to be erased, but as something that requires direction. The film acknowledges that pain in younger characters does not simply disappear through confrontation. It needs guidance, patience, and connection. That nuance becomes clearer after the immediate action of the film fades. Even Wade Wilson's humor, when remembered later, feels different than it does in the moment. What initially feels like constant comedic interruption begins to resemble emotional pacing. The jokes are not just entertainment, they are rhythm breaks that prevent emotional overload. Without them, the film would feel entirely different, heavier, more conventional, and less aligned with Wade's internal state. Another long term observation is how the film manages chaos in a controlled way. While it appears unpredictable, there is actually a consistent pattern of escalation and release. The film builds tension, disrupts it with humor, reintroduces stakes, and then breaks expectations again. This cycle repeats throughout, creating a structure that feels unstable on the surface but intentional underneath. That controlled instability is part of why the film remains memorable. It does not allow the viewer to settle into passive watching. Instead, it constantly demands recalibration emotionally, narratively, and tonally. You are always adjusting to what the film is doing next, even when that next thing is itself a joke about unpredictability. Over time, this experience becomes part of its identity. It is not just a superhero film with comedy, it is a film that actively resists being categorized in a stable way. Every attempt to define it precisely feels slightly incomplete because it keeps shifting between definitions. And yet, despite all this movement, it still feels grounded in something simple. People trying imperfectly to deal with themselves and each other. That simplicity is what holds everything together. So even when everything else is chaos, tone, structure, humor, action, the emotional core stays quietly consistent underneath it all. At this point, Continuing to unpack Deadpool 2 is less about discovering new facts and more about tracing how it reshapes the idea of what a superhero sequel can feel like when it refuses to stay inside a single emotional register. The film's identity is not built on stability but on controlled contradiction, yet somehow that contradiction becomes its most stable feature. One of the deeper ways to understand its lasting impact is to look at how it treats meaning itself. In many films, meaning is delivered through clearly framed dialogue, symbolic visuals, or structured character arcs. In Deadpool 2, meaning often arrives indirectly, hidden under jokes, or interrupted by them. A serious idea might be introduced, immediately undercut, and then quietly reinforced later without announcement. This layered delivery makes meaning feel less like instruction and more like discovery. The viewer is not guided to understanding in a straight line. Instead, understanding is scattered across moments that only connect when remembered together. That means the film's emotional structure is partly retrospective. You only fully get it after it has already moved on. Another element that becomes clearer with reflection is how the film uses contrast as its primary storytelling engine. Not just contrast between characters, but contrast within single scenes. Humor next to violence, sincerity next to irony, loss next to absurdity. Instead of separating these tones into different sections, the film stacks them on top of each other. This stacking effect creates emotional noise that feels chaotic in real time but meaningful in memory. Wade Wilson's identity continues to act as the central organizing force for this chaos. He is not just a character within the film, he is also a narrative device that justifies tonal instability. Because he is inconsistent, the film is allowed to be inconsistent. Because he is self aware, the film can comment on itself. Because he is emotionally defensive, humor becomes a valid emotional language rather than a distraction from it. Cable's presence continues to function as a counterweight even after analysis deepens. He represents a worldview where everything has already been decided, where grief becomes a fixed point rather than a process. But the film never allows this worldview to fully dominate. Instead, it places it in tension with Wade's unpredictability, suggesting that life is neither fully determined nor fully chaotic, but something uncomfortable in between. Domino's role remains deceptively simple, yet that simplicity becomes more meaningful over time. In a narrative filled with effort, struggle, and resistance, she operates without visible strain. That contrast makes her less of a power character and more of a thematic statement. Not everything in life is about forcing outcomes. Sometimes movement itself is enough. Russell's arc, when viewed through this reflective lens, becomes less about plot and more about emotional redirection. The film avoids turning his story into a clean transformation. Instead, it shows a shift in trajectory rather than a completed journey. That incomplete feeling is important. It reflects the idea that emotional development is ongoing, not finalized by narrative endings. Another long term observation is how the film handles audience expectation as a moving target. It sets up familiar patterns, then interrupts them, then occasionally fulfills them in slightly altered forms. Over time, viewers learn that predicting the film is less about guessing outcomes and more about anticipating how it will break its own expectations. This turns watching into a kind of active participation. The editing rhythm reinforces this experience. Instead of smooth transitions, the film often uses abrupt cuts, sudden tonal shifts, and compressed emotional beats. This creates a feeling of instability that mirrors Wade's internal state while also preventing emotional stagnation. Nothing is allowed to linger too long without interruption. Even the humor, when reconsidered in this context, feels more structural than decorative. It is not just layered onto scenes, it actively shapes pacing, tone, and emotional distance. In many ways, jokes function like pressure valves, releasing emotional buildup before it becomes overwhelming, then allowing tension to rebuild again. Over time, this creates a viewing experience that is less about linear storytelling and more about rhythmic fluctuation. The film breathes in cycles of seriousness and absurdity, never fully committing to either for too long. And yet, despite all this movement, fragmentation and tonal instability, there is still a sense of cohesion. That cohesion does not come from structure but from emotional repetition. The same ideas, loss, identity, control, change, keep resurfacing in different forms until they begin to feel unified. That is why the film remains difficult to pin down in a single sentence. It is not because it lacks direction, but because it refuses to reduce itself to one dimension. At this stage of reflecting on Deadpool 2, what becomes most clear is that the film's real structure is not built around events but around repetition with variation. It keeps returning to the same emotional ideas: loss, identity, control, connection, but each return is slightly different in tone, intensity, or context. That is why it feels both chaotic and consistent at the same time. One of the quieter long term impressions the film leaves is how it treats emotional resistance. Wade Wilson does not simply have trauma in a narrative sense. He actively resists processing it in a traditional way. Instead of confronting pain directly, he reframes it through humor, sarcasm, or self awareness. Over time, this creates a pattern where avoidance and honesty are constantly fighting for control of the same emotional space. This is why some moments in the film feel like emotional interruptions. A serious idea begins to form, then gets deflected, then returns later in a different shape. The film is not avoiding emotion, it is circling it. That circling pattern becomes one of its defining storytelling techniques. Cable's storyline, when viewed through this lens, also reflects a different kind of emotional resistance. He does not avoid pain through humor, he avoids it through certainty. His belief in fixed outcomes is a way of preventing emotional vulnerability. If everything is already determined, then nothing needs to be emotionally processed in real time. The film quietly challenges this by placing him in situations where certainty fails to provide comfort. Domino's presence continues to function as a contrast to both of these approaches. She neither resists emotion nor tries to control it. Instead, she operates with a kind of passive trust in unfolding events. This creates a triangle of emotional strategies within the film: avoidance through humor, avoidance through certainty, and acceptance through flow. Russell's arc adds another dimension to this structure. His emotional state is not shaped by avoidance or acceptance, but by volatility. He represents raw emotional output without filtering. The film positions him as someone still forming the mechanisms that other characters already use, some healthy, some harmful. His journey is not about resolving emotion but about learning direction. Another important aspect that becomes more visible over time is how the film uses interruption as a storytelling language. Almost every major emotional or action beat is interrupted in some way: by humor, by violence, by meta commentary, or by narrative shifts. These interruptions are not random, they are part of the film's rhythm. They prevent emotional scenes from becoming static and force the viewer to stay in a state of constant recalibration. This creates a viewing experience where attention is never allowed to fully settle. Instead, it moves in pulses: focus, interruption, refocus, reinterpretation. That rhythm mirrors the internal instability of the main character while also reflecting modern attention patterns in general. Even the film's structure begins to resemble a loop rather than a straight line when examined closely. Events do not simply progress forward, they often circle back to earlier emotional ideas with new context. This looping effect makes the narrative feel less like a journey with a fixed destination and more like a series of emotional revisits. Over time, this loop structure becomes part of the film's identity. It suggests that emotional growth is not linear. People return to the same feelings repeatedly, but with slightly different understanding each time. The film reflects that reality through its own storytelling shape. Another subtle layer is how the film treats consequence not as punishment but as persistence. Actions do not always lead to clean resolutions, instead, they continue to echo. Emotional decisions affect later behavior, even when the immediate situation changes. This creates a sense that nothing fully resets. Even when scenes change or tones shift, Wade's humor, when seen through this framework, becomes less like comedic relief and more like emotional continuity. It is not separate from his pain. It is the way his pain persists in altered form. Even when he is joking, the emotional context underneath remains active. Cable's seriousness functions similarly but in the opposite direction. His restraint is not absence of emotion, it is emotion held in a compressed state. The film constantly places these two emotional styles in contact, allowing each to expose the limits of the other. Domino remains the most structurally stable presence within this system, not because she is emotionally neutral, but because she does not force emotional outcomes. Her stability is not control, it is adaptability. That distinction becomes more meaningful the longer the film is examined. By this point, it becomes clear that Deadpool 2 is not just telling a story about characters, but experimenting with how emotional information is delivered, interrupted, and reassembled. It uses repetition, contrast, and disruption not as stylistic choices but as structural principles. And that is why, even after extended reflection, the film still feels active in memory. It does not sit still as a completed object. It continues to rearrange itself depending on what part of it you focus on, even after all the structural, emotional, and thematic layers already explored in Deadpool 2. There is still one final way to look at it, not as a story that is watched, but as a system that reacts. The film behaves less like a fixed narrative and more like something that responds to pressure, tone pressure, emotional pressure, genre expectations, and audience expectation all at once. This reactive system idea helps explain why the film feels so unpredictable but still coherent. Every time the story begins to stabilize into a familiar rhythm, it introduces something that destabilizes it again. That destabilization is not random, it is part of a constant balancing act. The film does not want equilibrium, it wants motion between extremes. One of the clearest expressions of this is how it handles emotional escalation. In traditional storytelling, emotion builds in a smooth curve toward a climax. Here, emotion rises, gets interrupted, gets reframed as humor, then returns later in a different emotional key. Instead of one continuous emotional line, you get overlapping emotional waves that interfere with each other. This creates a viewing experience where meaning is never delivered in a single moment. It is distributed across multiple moments that only become fully meaningful when mentally assembled. That is why the film often feels more meaningful after it ends than during individual scenes. Wade Wilson's role in this system is almost like a control switch. His personality dictates how much seriousness the film is allowed to sustain at any given moment. When he leans into humor, emotional distance increases. When he becomes sincere, the film briefly stabilizes before collapsing back into chaos again. This push and pull becomes the engine of the entire experience. Cable continues to act as the counterforce to this instability, but even his rigidity is not absolute. The film slowly reveals that his certainty is not strength, it is emotional protection. Every attempt he makes to enforce structure is quietly undermined by the unpredictability of the world around him. This does not defeat him in a traditional sense. It simply makes his worldview less sustainable. Domino's role, when examined from this final perspective, becomes almost like a neutral variable within the system. She does not push toward chaos or order. Instead, she moves through instability without attempting to resolve it. This makes her function less like a character in conflict and more like a stabilizing presence that does not interfere with the system's fluctuations. Russell, meanwhile, represents volatility without filter. His emotional responses are immediate, unstructured, and intense. The system around him tries to either redirect or contain that volatility, but never fully eliminates it. This reinforces the idea that emotion in the film is not something that is resolved, it is something that is redirected, absorbed, or transformed. Another final layer worth noticing is how the film treats identity as something constantly under construction. No character maintains a fixed emotional identity throughout. Weight shifts between humor and sincerity. Cable shifts between certainty and doubt. Even minor characters briefly reflect emotional contradictions before the narrative moves forward. This reinforces the idea that identity in the film is not a stable trait but a response pattern. Who a character is depends on what situation they are reacting to and how they choose to process it. That is why the film feels dynamic even when plot elements are minimal. Because identity itself is constantly moving, the film's structure, when viewed in full, resembles a cycle more than a progression. Emotional tension builds, breaks, reforms, and shifts direction. Humor interrupts seriousness re enters through different angles, and the cycle repeats. But each repetition is slightly altered, creating the illusion of progression through variation rather than linear development. That is why Deadpool 2 resists being summarized in simple terms. Any attempt to define it as purely comedy, action, parody, or drama misses how it continuously crosses those boundaries. It exists in the movement between categories rather than inside one, and in the end, that movement is what defines it most clearly. Not resolution, not structure, not even tone, but constant adjustment. At this point, continuing deeper into Deadpool 2 becomes less about adding new layers and more about recognizing how many layers were already doing the same job from different angles. The film's real trick is not complexity for its own sake, but repetition of emotional ideas through constantly changing surface forms. One of the final perspectives that helps tie everything together is viewing the film as a study of emotional translation. Every major feeling in the story, grief, anger, love, guilt, fear, is never expressed in a single direct form. Instead, each emotion is translated into something else before it reaches the audience. Grief becomes humor, fear becomes aggression, love becomes protection, guilt becomes overcompensation. Nothing arrives in its pure form. This constant translation is why the film feels layered even when scenes are simple on the surface. A joke is rarely just a joke, an action scene is rarely just action, a conversation is rarely just dialogue. Everything is carrying something else underneath it, and that something else is often emotional rather than narrative. Wade Wilson remains the central translator of emotion in the film. He takes internal discomfort and converts it into external performance. That performance is so constant that it becomes indistinguishable from personality. The film quietly raises an uncomfortable idea. Sometimes what we call personality is actually just repeated emotional translation habits. Cable's emotional translation works in the opposite direction. He takes external chaos and converts it into internal control. Instead of expressing emotion outwardly, he compresses it into discipline and action. The film positions both approaches side by side without declaring either fully correct or incorrect, but it subtly shows the limitations of both when taken to extremes. Domino continues to stand outside this translation system in a unique way. Her presence suggests a form of emotional interaction that does not require conversion or distortion. She does not appear to reshape emotion into another form. She simply moves through it. That contrast makes her feel almost like a different language operating within the same world. Russell's arc, when viewed through this lens, becomes a process of learning translation itself. His anger is raw and unfiltered at first, but the narrative gradually shows him encountering alternative ways of processing emotion. The film does not fully solve his emotional state, but it introduces the idea that emotion can be redirected without being erased. Another final insight is how the film treats chaos not as disorder but as information density. What appears chaotic is actually a high concentration of emotional, narrative, and tonal signals happening at once. The viewer's mind is forced to continuously filter, prioritize, and reinterpret what matters in real time. That cognitive engagement becomes part of the experience. This is why slower analysis often reveals more meaning than immediate viewing. The mind, after the fact, begins to separate layers that were overlapping in real time. Humor separates from emotion, action separates from meaning, dialogue separates from tone, and in that separation, structure becomes visible. The film's refusal to maintain stable tone is not just stylistic, it is functional. It prevents the viewer from settling into passive interpretation. Instead, interpretation becomes ongoing even after the film ends. Meaning is not delivered, it is reconstructed repeatedly in memory. Even the ending energy of the film reflects this philosophy. Rather than feeling like a clean closure, it feels like a pause in motion. Characters are not fully resolved, they are redirected, emotional arcs are not completed, they are adjusted, narrative threads are not tied off, they are left in a state of continuation. And that is why the film resists finality. It does not want to feel like a completed object, it wants to feel like something that could keep shifting if the camera stayed on it long enough. In that sense, Deadpool 2 ultimately behaves less like a story that ends and more like a system that stops being shown. At this stage, Deadpool 2 begins to feel like it is less about what happens next and more about how long a story can keep echoing after it stops moving forward. The interesting part is not continuation of events, but continuation of impact. How ideas, emotions, and tonal shifts keep resurfacing in the mind long after the screen goes dark. One of the final conceptual angles is to think of the film as an emotional feedback loop. Every joke carries a trace of seriousness underneath it, and every serious moment carries a trace of irony around it. These two layers keep feeding into each other. The humor softens the emotion, and the emotion gives weight back to the humor. Over time, neither exists independently, they become interdependent signals within the same system. Wade Wilson's character functions as the generator of this loop. He produces humor not just as reaction but as structure. His jokes are not interruptions to emotion, they are part of how emotion circulates. When pain becomes too direct, it is rerouted into humor. When humor becomes too heavy, it briefly reveals emotional truth. This constant rerouting creates a cycle that never fully stabilizes. Cable continues to represent resistance to that cycle. He attempts to treat emotion as something that can be controlled, minimized, or postponed. But the film repeatedly places him in situations where emotional leakage is unavoidable. No matter how rigid his exterior is, the environment around him forces interaction with unpredictability. In that sense, he is constantly negotiating with a world that refuses to obey his logic. Domino's presence, when viewed through this final lens, almost feels like a break in the feedback loop rather than part of it. She does not amplify emotion or resist it in the same way. Instead, she moves alongside it, unaffected by its intensity. This creates the impression of balance, not by controlling chaos but by not being disrupted by it. Russell's emotional energy adds volatility to the loop. His reactions are not filtered or translated in the same way as Wade or Cable. He introduces raw emotional output that forces the system to adjust around him. The film does not resolve this volatility, it integrates it into the flow of events, allowing instability to remain part of the structure rather than something to eliminate. Another final way to understand the film is through its relationship with repetition. Many ideas are introduced, disrupted, and then reintroduced in altered form. This repetition is not redundancy, it is reinforcement through variation. Each return to an idea adds a slightly different emotional angle, gradually building a layered understanding without formal explanation. This is why the film feels richer in memory than in individual moments. No single scene carries all meaning on its own. Meaning is distributed across repetition, meaning accumulates through comparison rather than isolation. Even the comedic structure contributes to this sense of accumulation. Jokes often refer back to earlier jokes or to expectations that were previously set up and broken. Over time, humor becomes less about surprise and more about recognition of patterns being reinterpreted. At a deeper level, the film can be seen as exploring how people process reality when they cannot fully separate emotion from awareness. Wade is aware of his own narrative existence. The audience is aware of genre expectations. The film itself is aware of both. This creates a layered consciousness where no single perspective fully dominates. That layered awareness is what allows the film to feel simultaneously structured and unstable. It is constantly aware of its own construction, and that awareness becomes part of its identity. By the time all of this is considered together, what remains is not a traditional conclusion but a recognition of pattern, emotion constantly rerouted, tone constantly shifting, identity constantly adjusting, meaning constantly reconstructed, and even after all analysis ends, that pattern does not feel finished. At this final extended layer of looking at Deadpool 2, the most useful way to understand it is not as something that develops ideas in a straight line, but as something that keeps reprocessing the same emotional material through different masks. Each mask changes the surface, but the underlying weight stays similar. One of the quietest truths the film keeps returning to is that emotional change is rarely clean. It does not arrive as a moment of clarity, it arrives as repeated friction, small shifts, temporary decisions, moments of softness surrounded by contradiction. Wade Wilson never becomes a different person in a traditional sense. Instead, he becomes someone who occasionally allows different versions of himself to surface depending on the situation. That is why his humor never fully disappears, even in serious moments. It is not just style, it is structure, it is how his mind organizes reality. The film subtly suggests that you cannot simply remove that layer without removing part of who he is. So instead, the story works with it rather than against it. Cable's arc, in contrast, becomes a study in emotional compression over time. He begins with a worldview that is extremely tight and controlled, but the film slowly introduces cracks into that structure. Not enough to fully break it, but enough to make it less absolute. His emotional evolution is not expansion, it is loosening. Domino continues to stand as a kind of counter model to both of these emotional systems. She neither compresses emotion nor constantly translates it. She simply exists within outcomes without attempting to dominate them. This makes her feel less like a character being developed and more like a principle being demonstrated inside the story. Russell, meanwhile, continues to represent emotional immediacy. His responses are unfiltered, direct, and often unstable. But over the course of the film, even his volatility begins to be shaped by interaction with others. Not fully controlled, not fully resolved, just slightly redirected. That subtle shift is important because it reinforces the film's broader idea that change is incremental rather than absolute. Another important perspective is how the film handles the idea of narrative self awareness as a permanent condition rather than a gimmick. Wade does not occasionally break the fourth wall as a comedic device, he exists within it constantly. That awareness changes how all emotional beats function. Nothing is purely immersive, because the character himself is always partially observing the structure of his own story. This creates a dual layer experience. On one layer, events are happening. On another layer, those events are being commented on, reframed, or questioned in real time. The audience is therefore always balancing two interpretations simultaneously, the emotional reality of the scene and the meta reality of the storytelling. Over time, this dual layer structure becomes normal within the film's logic. It stops feeling like disruption and starts feeling like baseline communication. That normalization is one of the film's most subtle achievements. It trains the viewer to accept instability as a form of coherence. Even the pacing reinforces this idea. Instead of building toward a single sustained climax, the film creates multiple smaller peaks that rise and fall repeatedly. Each peak is emotionally complete in isolation, but none of them function as final resolution. The result is a structure that feels like waves rather than a mountain. Those waves continue even in memory. When recalling the film, people often remember clusters of moments rather than a single linear progression. That is because the film itself is designed around clusters of emotional intensity rather than a continuous arc. Another final layer worth acknowledging is how the film treats identity under pressure. Every major character reveals different versions of themselves depending on what emotional or narrative pressure they are under. Wade becomes more vulnerable when humor fails. Cable becomes more uncertain when control fails. Russell becomes more reactive when guidance is missing. Domino remains consistent, but her consistency itself becomes meaningful under contrast. This idea suggests that identity is not a fixed point but a response pattern shaped by pressure. The film does not state this directly, but it demonstrates it repeatedly through character behavior. And so, when all layers are considered together, what Deadpool 2 ultimately constructs is not a traditional story with a clear endpoint, but a framework of emotional motion, where humor, pain, control, unpredictability, and awareness all keep interacting without ever fully settling into a final state. Even after analysis stretches this far, there is still no sense of closure in the traditional sense. At this point, pushing further into Deadpool 2 is really about observing what happens when a story stops being a sequence of events and becomes more like a pattern that the mind keeps replaying in different contexts. The film's lasting presence comes less from what it shows and more from how it behaves in memory. One of the final insights is that the film essentially trains the viewer to expect instability as a normal condition. Most mainstream narratives rely on stability as the default. Characters start in one emotional state, move through conflict, and end in a resolved form. Deadpool 2 quietly replaces that structure with something more fluid. Stability becomes temporary, and instability becomes the baseline. This is why even its emotional moments feel slightly unsteady. A serious exchange is never fully isolated from humor, and a comedic moment is never fully detached from consequence. The two constantly bleed into each other, creating a kind of emotional overlap where nothing is purely one thing at a time. Wade Wilson functions as the clearest expression of this overlapping system. His personality is not segmented into comedy mode and serious mode, it is a constant blend of both. Even when he is emotionally sincere, there is a layer of self awareness sitting underneath it. Even when he is joking, there is a trace of vulnerability inside it. The film does not separate these layers, it fuses them. Cable's presence continues to represent resistance to that fusion. He tries to maintain emotional separation, grief here, action there, purpose defined and contained. But the narrative repeatedly exposes how difficult that separation is in practice. Emotional states leak into behavior, even when tightly controlled. His arc subtly demonstrates that control is not the absence of emotion, but the management of it under pressure that constantly shifts. Domino remains important in this final framing because she exists outside both fusion and resistance. She does not appear to struggle with emotional separation or control in the same visible way. Instead, she responds to the world in real time, adapting without over defining outcomes. In a system built on instability and control, struggling against instability, she represents responsiveness without tension. Russell's emotional role also becomes clearer when viewed at this distance. He is not simply a problem to be solved or a character to be saved. He is a force of raw emotional input entering a system that is still learning how to process it. The film's response to him is not resolution but adjustment. His presence forces other characters to shift slightly, revealing their limitations and flexibility. Another final observation is how the film's humor evolves when viewed as structure rather than content. Many jokes are not just comedic lines, they are timing mechanisms. They control when the viewer can feel too much and when they are pulled back into distance. Humor regulates emotional proximity. It decides how close the audience is allowed to get to pain at any given moment. This creates a rhythm where emotional intensity is never sustained long enough to become static. Instead, it oscillates. That oscillation is one of the film's defining characteristics, and it continues even after viewing ends. When the mind replays scenes with alternating emotional interpretations, even its self awareness becomes part of that rhythm. The film's acknowledgement of itself as a film is not just a comedic device, it is a structural reminder that everything being experienced is mediated. That awareness prevents total immersion, but it also allows for a different kind of engagement. One where meaning is constantly double checked between feeling and observation. As a result, the film occupies a rare space where it is both emotionally direct and constantly self interrupting. It invites emotional response, then immediately reframes it, then returns to it later in altered form. That cycle becomes its identity, and in the end, what remains after all analysis is not a conclusion but a pattern recognition. Emotion expressed, emotion interrupted, emotion reframed, emotion returned. That loop does not resolve, it repeats.